Like Michael Jordan in the 97 finals, like Leslie Knope pitching the Harvest Fest to the Pawnee City Council and Chamber of Commerce, John Sheeran and myself are coming at you amid, I don't know, some recurring bugs that he and I continue to get. That's why we've been a little inconsistent with the shows. We apologize, but we're fighting through it. We are warriors. I'm Anthony. He's John. We're a little more nasally than we usually are and or hoarse-voiced, but it is what it is because we got to talk some Bengals. John, how you doing, buddy?
Happy New Year, Anthony. Happy New Year to all the listeners. Not the greatest way to start 2024, but we're in
a lot of ways.
We got 1 week to go, and we are literally and figuratively, I guess, kind of limping to this finish line here.
We are literally and figuratively doing so. The Bengals are as well. They made a valiant effort at things. We know that. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Chiefs game, but that's going to segue into a couple of little, once a year segments or different segments that we don't really get to do all that often. And that would be number one, some Bengals New Year's resolutions for their team this coming year, what we think they should be focusing on in the coming year for them to get back on track, back to the playoffs. And of course, 2024, as we look at impending free agency, as we look at draft needs, as we look at salary cap, etc., are we pessimistic? Are we optimistic? A little from column A, a little from column B. John and I are going to talk about that. So we've got a lot to chat about on the Orange and Black Insider. And if you are new here, welcome. You can get this show in a variety of ways. If you like tuning in live, usually we go either Wednesday night, Thursday night. We do a post-game show right after the game. And then, of course, we usually do an aftermath. Unfortunately, with John and I's health stuff, holidays, etc., the last couple of weeks have been a little inconsistent, so we apologize for that. But we usually bring you a handful of shows per week on this program, and you can subscribe to the YouTube channel underneath John there. There is a show icon if you are watching live or after the fact. There is an Orange and Black Insider show icon right next to that Cincy Jungle icon. Click that. There is a subscribe button. Click that. And the bell to be notified when we go live, when new content is available. You can also give our videos a thumbs up. That helps us out. And of course, our show is one of a handful on the Cincy Jungle podcast channel that you can get through your favorite audio streamer, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Amazon, all of the ones. We are there. Our show, Coach Speak and Chalk Talk with Matt Minnick, the coach. And of course, 3 and Out with Jason and Kevin, and Talking Football with Bengal Jim, who had Andre Yoshivash a couple of weeks ago and had CBS Sports' John Breach and the social media sensation, the Bengals mailman, on the show this last week here. So go check that one out too. All right. Well, as we mentioned, in case you've been living under the rock, the Bengals playoffs hopes have been dashed. And of course, unfortunately, it happened at the hands of the Chiefs once again. They end the Bengals season for the second year in a row, this time a little earlier than the year prior. Bengals were up 17-7 in this game, John. And I thought they were doing a lot of nice things on defense. I mean, they were kind of getting some pressure here and there and just making stops and, forcing field goals, especially late when the Chiefs were moving the ball. They were aided by, predictably, a couple of big drops by Chiefs receivers. And then, of course, the Bengals just kind of shot off to a nice lead, and then the offense completely stalled out. in the second half. There were some questionable calls by the officials late in the game that didn't do them any favors. The Bengals end up losing 25-17, and thus their playoff chances, their magic ride that was the post-Joe Burrow injury era is over.
Yeah, I mean, I think we maintain a good sense of objectivity here when it comes to the refs and their shortcomings. It was not intentional grounding. I feel like we can all kind of agree on that. My stance on it is always there's no agenda against teams. It's just general incompetence league wide for these part-time employees who are over their head and probably need better training and whatnot. But this game obviously goes beyond just an errant Jake Browning pass. They were up, like you said, 10 in the first half because Browning was very much settled in. I think the offensive line came into this game, at least I think it was it might have been Brian Callahan who was talking about it. They said that they wanted to make sure that Chris Jones was not a factor. Like, do everything in your power to make sure that 95 for the Chiefs is not wrecking the game like he did last year. And unfortunately, Chris Jones is eventually going to Chris Jones, right? I think they matched him up against both of the Bengals tackles. I think Orlando Brown did a good job on a couple reps, but he got the better of Jonah and the better of Cordell Wilson as well. So, elite players are going to show up regardless of the states of their respective teams. And there were a few moments where Jamar Chase did the same thing, but he was playing clearly less than 100%, as was T. Higgins, who suffered a hamstring injury. And I think a very similar issue popped up compared to last year when you had the Chiefs doing their classic double doubles, which would be, constantly having a safety over the top of these vertical weapons and, the scheme that allows them to limit Chase and Higgins. Now, there wasn't really anyone else on offense that kind of stepped up in the passing game. I think Irwin had like 0.2 or 0.4 yards per route run. You had a not so very good game from Tanner Hudson as well. So you entered this season with on the heels of that game in the AFC Championship game where your ancillary options on offense were pretty much non-factors. And you enter this offseason again with a lot of questions, and now you're entering it with, guys who are set to enter free agency. They don't have a single tight end under contract. They don't have 2 of their 3 starting receivers under contract. And of course, on defense, they gave up 6 plays that totaled, I think, 220 yards, according to ESPN Stats and Info. You can't win like that. And that's been Lou Narumo's message for the better part of feels like 2 months. And the explosive plays continue to just kill them and gave the Chiefs the life that they needed to engineer a comeback. And I thought the Chiefs were going to lean more on the ground game because they couldn't find anything in the passing game. But it seemed like every member of the Bengals secondary had a pretty big lapse in this one that allowed the Chiefs to drive down the field. And 6 field goals were enough because the offense couldn't do anything.
Offense couldn't do anything. And, it felt like this was a game that the Bengals should have just handled. It still doesn't look like things are right with Kansas City. Pacheco had a huge game, obviously, and made a big difference. There's no doubt about that. But this Chiefs team is still trying to figure out answers. And if this is the same team that takes the field in the postseason, I would be very surprised if they make it far based on what I've seen, because they just don't appear to have much going on now. I mean, Kelsey was, not doing much in this game, and the Bengals kind of had a lot of answers where you go, well, this is forcing field goals. I mean, this is kind of what you want when you play this team, and yet still they come up with the short end of the stick. Higgins out again. You mentioned Chase had the injury he was kind of dealing with throughout the game, and yeah, I mean, things kind of crawled into a shell late in the game for the Bengals on offense, and I think finally, the injuries and different things occurred where you go, caught up to them rather, where you go, okay, well, this is kind of just where the magic runs out here, so to speak. So Bengals lose. They are out of the playoffs, and this hyper competitive division that they are in, man, it's showing a lot of competitiveness, obviously, this year, and different teams are staying alive. We knew the Steelers were going to be in it at the end. Obviously, the Browns clinched, the Ravens have clinched, and so there's still some things to be sorted out at the end of the week here. But let's talk a little bit about this, John. It's the new year. We just discussed some of the issues that we witnessed against the Chiefs, and some of which were improved upon from the week prior, etc. But some of which are recurring themes from this entire season. So let's talk a little Bengals New Year's resolutions, and we can talk more than one each year. So if you are the Cincinnati Bengals, you're making a list of your New Year's resolution. Everybody knows what New Year's resolutions are, right? This is, I'm going to resolve to, eat better or get to the gym or stop smoking or whatever, whatever it is. If you're the Bengals, specific to their football team, what is, you don't have to go in order either, but what's a top resolution you think that you have in your mind for this team as they look forward to 2024?
It's tough because the way that they built the team of the past 3 years was honestly pretty lucky. They pretty much didn't strike out in free agency until this past year, right? I mean, they were just hitting on all cylinders and rebuilding the offensive line for the most part, rebuilding the defense. And in the draft, they were very successful for the most part in the early rounds of 2020, 2021, and even, they're showing some decent returns in 2022 with Cam Taylor-Britt. So I think if this team wants to be competitive next year, amidst a lot of inevitable turnover on the roster, they have at least 18 free agents, and a lot of them are starters. You're going to be entering the season probably with less than half of the starters from that Super Bowl team who are going to still be here, right? Like they can't possibly keep everyone, but this is still 2024 is still a year where you have ample cap space because the Burrow contract is not going to completely take up that, and you still have plenty of cash to kind of maneuver around with. I think the resolution is to be more aggressive and just finding short-term holes instead of trying to do the whole the process of the past few years, which again, I think the way that it all happened kind of immediately in 2021 is a pretty rare thing. And if they want to go all in on just the major positions of weakness in ways that we haven't really seen them do before. And it's kind of hard to explain that too, because again, like I'm not saying they haven't been aggressive, but I think just with what the team is now and what the future is likely going to hold with even more changes coming and less flexibility, there should be a sense of aggression in terms of just making sure that whatever is left after this year, I mean, it's one of their last true opportunities to kind of take the core of this team, because again, I think the core for the most part is kind of going out the window in terms of just a lot of leaders and a lot of expensive veterans kind of maybe going to different opportunities.
I like that. I'm gonna harp on something that I harped on all last week. And again, I keep pointing out the great article by Paul Dehner Jr. where he relayed some quotes about physicality. Now, the Bengals have decided, and for good reason, they have decided to build their team in the draft with highly athletic players, guys with big athletic profiles and the height, weight, speed, agility, measurables, etc. And a couple of times they have married those profiles with guys who are, known as physical players. I'm specifically looking at Cam Taylor-Britt as a guy that was known to be a physical guy as a corner, willing tackler, et cetera, et cetera. I don't really know precisely which position or players I want to specifically single out, whether it's on offense or defense, but you got to get that edge back. And I think it begins with building your trenches, both depth wise and for the defensive side of the ball, at least getting rotational pass rush help from multiple spots on that defensive line. You're going to need to figure out if DJ Reader is going to be close to himself by the time regular season rolls around and what you may pay him if you believe that is the case, or you're going to have to find a replacement because that is a pretty gnarly injury to come back from that he is dealing with. So losing that run stopper is going to be painful going forward. If you do not have him, you got to find a solution there. If you're the linebackers on this team, I understand, going for the strip and they've made a lot of plays enforcing fumbles, kind of as they're maybe carrying a guy or vice versa, but you got to start wrapping up and tackling. You cannot allow major rushing performances, particularly in this division, John. The Baltimore Ravens have a formidable rushing attack with a lot of different players featured there. We know the Browns, especially with Nick Chubb coming back, they're going to want to do that as well. The Steelers, they're, with their quarterback situation, It's physical. It's physical in this division. I think they have to not only focus on being physical, but they have to keep a watchful eye on the backyard, which is the AFC North, and figure out multiple ways to get back to being physical, solidifying the trenches, protect the quarterback, rush the quarterback.
Yeah, if we want to get into specifics, I think the biggest, most glaring weakness right now is defensive tackle, personally, because you don't know if Reader's coming back. You don't know if he's even going to be healthy to start the season if they were able to retain him, which I think is still more likely not than him coming back. You just have nothing there in terms of just burst up the middle. They've been missing that for 2 years now, and it's beyond time to kind of get it remedied and be aggressive in doing so. You talk about athleticism at defensive tackle. They need athleticism pretty much all over the offensive line. You're looking at potentially upgrading 2 spots, be it left guard and right tackle. It's going to be interesting to see if they are aggressive in doing both. If they're even aggressive in doing one, they might want to just prioritize continuity with that group, considering that it stayed together for the majority of the season. But even still, like, Jonah Williams is a free agent. We don't know. He was pretty mum on the subject of maybe coming back. I think he's still kind of deciding that, and I think that's perfectly fair considering how this past year kind of went with him. But getting more athletic at offensive line, just like at defensive line, just goes a long way in terms of your run defense, but also in terms of just making sure that this highly invested pass rushing group for the Bengals actually gets the job done. It's not just relying on Trey Hendrickson having 12 more sacks than the next closest guy on this defensive line. And then beyond that, it's the pass catchers. Again, not a single tight end is under contract, and I don't know how many of them you want to bring back. You probably want to bring back maybe like Hudson and Sample. I think the door is open for exciting possibilities at receiver. If you do end up moving on from both Higgins and Boyd, I think you have very athletic, developing guys in Charlie Jones and Yoshi to pair with Chase, but I don't think you want maybe more than just one of those guys starting next year. You definitely need a new starter if you're going to move on from both those guys. And even if you tag T. Higgins, he's just around for 1 year. He's been banged up this year. I don't know how much you can rely on him. Like, you need solid, athletic, explosive answers. Like, they've prioritized speed in the secondary, and they need to translate that throughout the rest of the roster going forward too.
Okay. So is speed another resolution then for you? Team speed or speed at other spots? Is that where you're going next for another one?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you can never have enough of it, considering the same very similar issues exist just with his team. Like, they need to prioritize speed at offensive line. Get out in space, increase the effectiveness of zone blocking and increase the effectiveness of just screens and just getting out in space in general. Like, it's beyond just, finding tall, big dudes that can potentially absorb bull rushes, which they're not even very good at that part anyway. So I want them to prioritize athletes up front on both sides of the ball. I think that it's just beyond time that they start doing that. I think it allows a lot more creativity going forward too.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are looking for explosiveness, a little more out of the running back position and other areas too. I'm going to build on that, and this is going to kind of sound a little off the wall maybe right when I say it, but one thing I would prioritize, and it's something I've been thinking about for the last couple of weeks here, particularly with some of the buzz that this guy has got on his new team. Listen to your players. And what I mean by that is, and this year may not be, them talking to the media and saying these sound bites and whatnot. But John, do you remember all throughout 2022, you'd have DJ Reader kind of talk to the media. Mike Hilton would say some things. They'd be answering questions about, how did they sign off many of those questions, or how did they sign off many of those interviews? Do you remember? This is 2022 I'm talking about.
Yeah, it was like, it's disrespectful.
And re-sign Jesse Bates, right?
Oh, yeah.
Re-sign Jesse Bates. Now, that didn't come to fruition. The Bengals didn't value that position and what have you. I still have high hopes, and this will maybe go into our next segment about pessimism, optimism. I still have high hopes for the young safeties the Bengals employ back there, but there is a reason that your top defensive players, there is a reason that your team captains identified this player as a guy that says, re-sign this guy. They weren't saying re-sign Von Bell. They weren't saying re-sign X, Y, and Z. It was both of them, if not more. Re-sign Jesse Bates. Re-sign. And so they saw the value. And again, you look at this defense this year. you've heard about what Von Bell and Jesse Bates did back there in terms of lining up different players on the defense and making sure players were in different spots that made sense to everybody. You saw the big plays that they made in the postseason, the last two postseasons. When your players and the players you've entrusted as captains on this team are coming out and saying, re-sign this guy. Now, granted, it always kind of was with a chuckle, and the people doing the interviews would kind of chuckle with them, et cetera. But there was truth to that, and they wanted that to happen. The Bengals did not listen because it is a position they did not value. And I think while we can say, well, they're just not tackling well and they're weak at defensive tackle and all this kind of stuff, I still think losing those two guys in the very same offseason, I think it just killed a lot of the morale and really the skill in their defense and the way the vision back there and the way that those guys saw how offenses would line up. So if there is exit interviews or there are exit interviews with players, granted, they're not going to be saying this stuff in the media now, and they're saying, hey, keep T. Higgins, but pay him, whatever, or keep Jonah Williams, whatever. Listen to your players because they have a beat on things and a different point of view and are on the field on a play-to-play basis with these guys that coaches, front office people are not.
Yeah, and I think you're going to get that with Reader too. I think Inarumo already planted up his flag. Very obviously, I might add, there's no reason why Lunar wouldn't want DJ Reader to stick around for a couple more years. But it's a weird balance, I think. Not weird, but an intriguing balance of maintaining continuity, but also avoiding giving out raises to guys that may or may not be worth it based off of who they are presently compared to who they were in years past, and taking advantage of that flexibility by getting younger and getting quicker and whatnot. I think it made all the sense in the world to re-sign Jesse Bates. I don't think anyone necessarily disagreed. I think the slander about him was pretty absurd and how he only thrived when the Bengals defense was bad and he could look his best. He's clearly proven people wrong with what should be an all-pro season for him down in Atlanta. With Higgins, it might be a little bit more blurry, right? Just because you have the durability concerns, just because he was coming off a pretty bad season in that regard. So the balance of keeping these locker room favorites and leaders with also obtaining that flexibility in terms of cap space and cash to get younger, to get faster, and to keep the window open, I think is the most intriguing part of this offseason. And in regards to that secondary, the reason why I didn't really bring it up in the first place is because Nick Scott was supposed to be that veteran fix of losing both Bates and Bell, and he failed miserably in that regard. So they had to rely on Jordan Battle to start halfway through the season. They had to put Dax Hill in maybe situations that they didn't want to, or they kind of left him out there exposed a little bit, or they just hadn't maybe doing too much, right? And both guys showed that they were still inexperienced rookies, and it definitely cost them. But I don't think outside of finding a better version of Nick Scott, a guy who's still pretty cheap but experienced, I'm not sure how much change we're going to see in the secondary, specifically at safety. I think they have to allow these guys to develop and take that, I guess, technically second-year leave for Dax Hill and second-year leave for Jordan Battle. And the same goes for, obviously, DJ Turner, too. I think they're excited about him starting a full year and have a full offseason as the starter. So I think it's going to be a lot of continuity, and I guess hope is the word in terms of those guys developing. But I don't really foresee, a lot of, attention of or aggressively trying to rebuild that secondary because they just invested so many young pieces in it.
Yeah, I don't really either. But here's this thing. You mentioned Higgins and Boyd, right? And the potential that the Bengals, there is a scenario that, the Bengals end up losing both of them this year because of free agency. But I look at last year, not only did the Bengals lose Bell and Bates, they lost a hybrid swing player in Trey Flowers. They opted not to re-sign him, but he was a useful player for them for 2 years. Along with, you could kind of say, well, he's a safety or he's a corner or he's a high, whatever. But I mean, essentially, you lost 3 critical, and even if Flowers is a utility player, so to speak, you lost 3 critical players in your secondary in one offseason, and a lot of veteran presence, a lot of veteran IQ back there in one single offseason. So that's where I look to the wide receiver, and I guess this may be, unless you've got another resolution to share, John, this might be a good segue into the pessimism, optimism segment that we wanted to talk about. But this is where I get a little worried where, we can say, well, Higgins had a down year because he was hurt and this and that and the other thing, and he wants too much money. Can you afford to pay both of them? Boyd's at the end of his career. And I mean, still, you lose that production, that experience, and that three-headed monster that this team has sported for the last 3 years. That's a big loss for one position group in one offseason. And I like Charlie Jones. I like Yoshi. They had limited snaps this year, to say the least. It seems to be a very steep learning curve, and it reminds me a lot of the safety situation where you got a lot of hope with the guys that you've got waiting in the wings if there is a massive exodus at that position group. But we kind of saw what the growing pains looked like this year.
Yeah, and we kind of have a precedent for this. It's not a perfect one-to-one scenario, but when Marvin Jones and Mohamed Sanu both left in the same offseason, their replacements were Tyler Boyd and Brandon LaFell. And there were a bunch of other issues with that 2016 Bengals team, but there was a clear loss of athleticism at the receiver position. AJ Green got hurt I think halfway through that year, and those issues were clearly expanded upon themselves. So I don't imagine that they want to do that again. Considering that they can franchise T, I think they still want to open the window to keep him long term. So I would probably at this point expect the tag to be used in terms of replacing Boyd. I think Jones is probably in line to do that, and I think giving him more snaps towards the later part of this year was kind of an indication of that anyways. But you're right, man. It's scary considering that the offense, it had a brief moment this year where things were clicking, and they only really got to see that for a few weeks, and now there's just a bunch of different changes. And I think my final resolution, I guess, would be, because I know people are going to talk about who's calling plays and if that should change. I think coaching deserves to be put in the microscope, but maybe not for just changing play callers. You have Joe Burrow beginning another offseason injured, and we don't know for sure when he's coming back. And obviously, this has been 3 straight years of him ending the offseason not 100%, not able to practice in training camp, and the beginning of those regular seasons are impacted by that. I think the true resolution should be to have clear alternatives, contingencies with schemes, with game plans, just in case that Burrow is not ready to go. And have whoever I'm assuming it's going to be Jake Browning. He's an exclusive rights free agent. I would imagine they'll bring him back to be the backup. Have a plan with Browning in place in case Burrow does miss time, and make sure that you're not starting the regular season with either a hobbled Burrow or a wide-eyed backup quarterback that's trying to run the Burrow offense. That needs to be in the back of their minds this year, because they have 3 years of evidence that says what they're trying to do in the offseason and what they're hoping for. It leaves them with their ass in the ground.
All right, well, let's transition. This is one school of thought for this season for the Bengals is this last season. Hey, kudos, because you were in it till the second to last week of the year, and you were, had your team in playoff contention without your starting quarterback. Your stud wide receivers missed some time. You lost your defensive tackle. I mean, you kind of say, hey, tip of the cap. It just wasn't meant to be because of the health and all of that this year. The other aspect is, well, I mean, did you really, to your point that you just brought up, what kind of contingency plans did you have in place? And is this roster too top heavy in certain areas? And so, and that's what caused an inevitable collapse on a season with Super Bowl aspirations. So as we look ahead to 2024, John, when you look at the impending free agents that the Bengals have, and we're talking DJ Reader, we're talking T. Higgins, we're talking Tyler Boyd and others. There's also, I believe this is accurate. This is from Spotrac here. I will set this up here. The 2024 team salary cap space tracker. It shows the Bengals currently at a little north of 70 million right now. Of course, that could change drastically if they use that franchise tag on T, etc. So with that space, you could say, well, they've got some flexibility, but then you've also got the Chase contract, all kinds of different things. Where's your head at with this team going forward? Pessimism, optimism, somewhere in between?
Somewhere in between. I think, again, they maybe rely on filling too many holes in the draft and sometimes waiting too long to fill those holes. And sometimes, in some cases, they just leave their holes kind of open if the draft doesn't kind of fall their way. Like that was a problem with tight end. That was a problem with running back. Both positions ended up being, liabilities for most of the year. Outside of Joe Mixon, who had, a pretty decent season as a first alternate for the Pro Bowl. They just have too many holes, I think, entering this offseason, and they're going to have holes after some of these free agents inevitably leave, and they have some replacements to kind of waiting in the wings. But I'm not totally optimistic that they're going to take that aggressive approach and enter the draft, feeling like that they can go best player available. But I'm not entirely pessimistic either, considering I think potentially going 0-6 in the AFC North is a pretty big wake up call. 1-5 is pretty much the same anyways, considering those 5 losses basically eliminated their chance of making the playoffs. So I don't think they really love that. I think they recognize that this is, again, still like the last upcoming season where they have a pretty decent amount of cap flexibility with Joe Burrow under contract. So I do think that there's always going to be that recognition, and I think they're aware of that. But this team has never really been one to go completely all in, and I don't really expect that. So I kind of find myself in this gray area, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I lean a little bit myself. I lean a little bit more optimism because you say, okay, well, renewed health, you're getting Burrow back, and anytime you have your quarterback, you got a shot, especially the quarterback of that caliber, and then you've got the top wide receiver. You still have some of your offensive line pieces in place and under contract. You've got Trey Hendrickson under contract, so there are a lot, and then you're again, if you are a glass half full type of person, you look at that secondary, the play this year, and you go, okay, well, learning curve year. A lot of young faces, they're getting their first taste of snaps, and you can look at the Cam Taylor-Britt ascension this year from, last year, kind of getting some time late and doing some things to being a borderline Pro Bowl player for much of this year. Then the injury kind of hurt that one there. So, I mean, you could kind of say, well, I mean, maybe the rest of those guys or most of those guys are on a similar track here next year, but that's a lot of, hope. It's a lot of kind of just, a wing and a prayer a little bit. I mean, obviously you have faith in your draft picks and the athletic profiles and everything, but it's just like, it's a lot of what ifs. It's a lot of, well, what if they take that next step? And so it's an interesting time for me for the Bengals because it's kind of to what you said earlier, they need to see some of these guys still develop, but they also are in a position with the Chase contract coming due. Higgins may or may not be around for a year or so. Burrow now on the big contract. They're at a point where they can't really sit and wait. They can't wait around and wait. They have to be aggressive. They have to see if these guys develop and everything, but they have to be aggressive and they have to understand that, each year that passes and each year that slips through their fingers of a Super Bowl win is, very, very valuable because these guys aren't really getting that much younger. And you've got Burrow now, late-ish 20s coming up here. And you've got some big bills coming due with Higgins, Chase, et cetera. So, yeah, I trend optimism, but I have a lot of hesitancies as well, pulling me back a little bit.
Yeah, for me, it's just a matter of if 2021 is, replicable. And I think people need to recognize of how rare of that turnaround it was. I think they said it, NFL history, of being the first team that win like 4 games the previous season to go to the Super Bowl the next. And it was just hit after hit after hit, right decision after right decision after right decision. A lot of it was luck too, man. Like it was good scouting. It was good process by the front office, but having all those guys, immediately develop and fit the team, fit the culture, fit the scheme and everything, it was as magical, I think, as people should remember it. And obviously it doesn't need to be as drastic as it was then because the team was terrible at the end of 2020. And I think as long as Burrow is healthy and he has time, the Bengals will always be, at the very least, competing for a playoff spot. But obviously, how much do you want to maximize him and how much do you want to maximize the team around him? And I think to their credit, even knowing that Burrow is good and he's developed already pretty quickly in 4 years, they still haven't really used that as a crutch to say, oh, we don't have to make every single move, right? We don't have to improve every single aspect of the team. I think they've still done a decent job of not entirely sitting on their hands, but I think there's always a case where it can be ramped up. And especially entering this year with all the issues that you incurred outside of the injuries, that still needs to be the message.
Do you think that the Bengals will be aggressive in free agency this year? Outside free agency?
It really does depend on who they resign first. Like, again, I think we can both safely say that the tag is probably the most likely option with T. It's just a matter of if they want to go through that process with his agent. Again, I think most of their top free agents are going to seek offers elsewhere, which again opens up a lot of space, but also opens up a lot of holes. And we don't really have a good grasp on what the market is going to be at some of these positions. So I would say it's not going to be worse necessarily or like less active than last year, even though last year kind of started a little bit late and then kind of caught fire once Orlando Brown was brought into the picture. Like I'm not expecting like immediate signings again. We could talk so much more about this in the next 2 months, and that may upset some people. But I think there will be at the very least the same level of aggression as the past couple of years.
I would agree with that. I don't know if it's going to be full bore, but I do think it needs to be closer to what they did in 21 to really bolster some things going forward, because they have some work to do for sure. But I think overall I would trend optimist, but there are some things where I go, I don't know if I'm pessimistic about it. I just have a lot of questions. And if they didn't have the quarterback in place, if we were talking about Burrow not having his deal done, all that kind of stuff, I'd feel a lot worse than things. But again, though, you look at some of the things that you rely on. When you rely on health on a somewhat top heavy roster as kind of your, well, we got to be healthy. Well, every team needs to be healthy. The bottom line is, as you play 17 games and more in the postseason, that's just not totally the reality. So sometimes you got to create your own luck in that way and make sure that you have contingency plans, that your roster's in good shape.
Mm-hmm. And I think just how the rest of the division is kind of developed alongside of them. The Bengals were once the hunters, then they became the hunted, and now they went from first to worst in a matter of just a few months. And I think the Ravens kind of filling out their roster in the way that they did and being aggressive, and I think obviously coordinator changes were a part of that too, and that's going to be another thing that potentially is a problem that the Bengals have to incur. Brian Callahan was named one of the 5 highest rated offensive coordinators by the NFLPA. I think he'll probably be another name that gets propped up in this year's hiring cycle. He got an interview last year with the Colts. He lost that job to Shane Steichen. But considering how the offense kind of ended with a backup quarterback in there, even if he's not the one technically speaking to Jake Browning in the headset and calling the plays, he still has an incredible amount of influence in the offense. And I think this year, this end of the season, is going to do a lot to kind of bolster his candidacy, and how the Bengals potentially transition from one offense coordinator to the next, and what the evolution of the offense is for that. It could be reminiscent of what the Ravens kind of went under this year with Todd Monken, but it's just another wrinkle, it's another variable in this offseason. And there's still so much more we need to kind of learn as the months go on.
Well, before we talk about the game with the Browns, we'll just chat a little bit about that. We've got another bet slip this week, and John, this is one of the trickier weeks because, as we'll discuss in just a little bit, we don't know who's really going to play for these. I mean, Jeff Driscoll starting for the Browns at quarterback, right? The Bengals have Jake Browning, and both Zach Taylor said both the Bengals wide receivers, Higgins and Chase, have their respective issues health-wise this week. So we don't really know exactly what's going to take place in terms of rosters, but we did make 4 picks, and not a guarantee, of course, but stuff we like here at Cincy Jungle. The 4 picks net a plus 325. You have the Bengals covering the 7-point spread here. So we believe that the Bengals will win, and at least as a Cincy Jungle network, 7-point spread, over 4 total touchdowns. So high scoring game from the Bengals, of course, probably taking advantage of the Browns resting a lot of stars on both sides of the ball. Maybe even a pick six, multiple turnover type of game because of the inexperience. We will see. Under 22.5 total points for the Cleveland Browns. And the Bengals race to 25 points are the 4 there. So kind of a wacky one in a game, John, that will not be featuring likely a lot of prominent players, particularly on the Brown side of the ball.
Right. And I feel like it's a good time to mention who the Browns quarterback will be. None other than 2018 second half of the year starter Jeff Driscoll, who was signed off the Cardinals practice squad or something like that. It's the 5th starting quarterback for the Browns this year, which means that Kevin Stefanski and the Browns could potentially win with 5 different quarterbacks in a 17-game schedule, which is absurd. But that factors into going under 22.5 points for the Browns. Again, we don't know how many of their offensive starters are going to play alongside Jeff Driscoll. There's not a huge need, obviously, with that seating kind of locked up. But, say Amari Cooper does play, at least half the game. Driscoll just kind of coming in against his former team, obviously very rusty, didn't really bother Joe Flacco. But, yeah, I would say the Bengals have a decent chance of covering the spread just because I think they're just going to try harder. But we saw what a Joe Burrow offense was against this arguably the best defense in the NFL. And if Myles Garrett is out there, if Denzel Ward is out there, which again, we don't really know, it's unlikely at this point, it might be a little closer. But I think based off of where things are trending with what the Browns are doing, and I guess maybe the feel in the Bengals locker room and the attitude right now, it wouldn't surprise me if the Bengals kind of ran away with this one at the end.
Yeah, maybe. Well, that is the DraftKings slip for this week that we've got for you. And of course, got to remind you, if you have a gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit www.1800gambler.net. In New York, call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY, which is 467-369. In Connecticut, help is available for problems gambling. You can call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org. Please play responsibly. On behalf of Boot Hill Casino and Resort, licensee partner Golden Nugget Lake Charles, 21 plus, age varies by jurisdiction, void in Ontario. See sportsbook.draftkings.com/football for eligibility terms and responsible gaming sources. So thanks for our continued partnership with DraftKings this year. We've had a lot of fun kind of giving you some picks throughout the year, etc. So, John, you are, just to kind of start closing things up, you're kind of saying you think the Bengals are going to run away with this. There's just not a lot to break down, unfortunately, because, again, We're like, who's going to be out there and stuff. So you kind of are feeling the Bengals may run away with this one here.
Oh, I said they could. I don't know if they will, though.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm feeling like a 17-16 game where like McPherson kicks another game winner. I think Driscoll is going to just be running around doing stuff. Bengals defense, I think even if they are inspired, still not very good. I think Stefanski's still a really good play caller, and he's gotten the better of Luna Rumo in their respective tenures. So I think the Browns will still score like at least 16 points. But if Myles Garrett isn't out there, if those lockdown cornerbacks aren't out there, the Bengals are going to be trying to get this win. And I think they're going to be trying a little bit harder than their opponents. So I'll say a 1-point victory.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's going to be pretty ugly. Either it's going to be ugly, high scoring and ugly, which is just, turnovers left and right and all kinds of different stuff, or it's going to be a low scoring game. Obviously, we did give you a Cincy Jungle bet slip there that maybe tells a little bit of a different story there, but I will say, I'll say 19-13, the Bengals win. Just an ugly game, but at some point, you got to start beating the Browns because the Bengals have not been good at that in the Zach Taylor era, and even a little bit before that at the end of Marvin Lewis's tenure. They have not been beating the Browns. They have not been beating the Steelers, and they need to change that quickly. And even if this game is pretty much meaningless for both teams, that's it may give you some good vibes heading into the offseason.
Yeah, I think considering how much they've lost to the Browns in recent years, anytime you get a win over them, I think it feels good. I don't think, because I remember like at the end of the Marvin Lewis era where they would win some games at the back half or like the final 2 weeks, and you start to wonder, is that going to impact whether or not Lewis sticks around, especially because they were division games. I think the message is still pretty much been sent to this team in the front office. Losing the first 5 division games is the definition of unacceptable, and I don't think beating a backup Browns team at home is really going to change that. It will change the draft order. I think they can go as high as, or I guess low as 18th and as high as like 12th or 13th. Right now they're at 16th. Personally, Anthony, I don't know about you, I feel like that's pretty much, you're going to find the same caliber of players. So even for fans who are rooting for a loss for a better draft pick, I'm not really sure it's really going to matter in April anyways. So the Bengals are going to be trying their butts off for a win here for the sake of pride. And that if there's any reason to watch, it's that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a difference between, and this is maybe a little bit of a drop the mic final thought thing. I think there's a little bit of a difference between sometimes a player sneaks out of the top 10 and it's there at 12 that is not there at 18, but you also get a lot more teams that are way more aggressive in moving up in the draft to get up and get those guys. And so I think the Bengals, they've done a better job of it of late. They've got a couple more picks. I think they've got 9 right this year. So they've got a couple more picks to play with. You can now trade compensatory picks, et cetera. So maybe get a little creative to get up and get a more premier player. Doesn't have to be in the first round per se, but if you're in those other rounds, they did it with Cam Taylor-Britt. That seemed to work out pretty well. So don't be afraid to move up in the draft and do some things.
For sure. And again, that's a conversation for months down the road. I guess if I have a mic drop, something cool I found out last night when we learned the Pro Bowl rosters, Jamar Chase and Trey Hendrickson are back-to-back Pro Bowlers, which is pretty cool. Trey Hendrickson, I think, is now one of 2 Bengals defensive linemen with 3 Pro Bowlers nominations. The other one is Geno Atkins, so pretty good company there. This one surprised me, Anthony, though. There are 13 receivers in NFL history now to make the Pro Bowl in each of their first 3 seasons. The Bengals have 4 of them. I didn't know Chris Collinsworth was a back-to-back Pro Bowler to begin his career. Isaac Curtis obviously was one. AJ Green was one. Pretty good company and pretty good track record for the Bengals developing these guys pretty early on.
They know how to draft wide receivers. They know how to draft them, and they know how to get use out of them early. And so pretty good company for Chase there, and congratulations to both those guys for getting into the Pro Bowl. This has been the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. He's John Sheeran. I'm Anthony Cosenza. Keep it to CincyJungle.com and what John's doing over at A to Z Sports with the AFC North and Bengals coverage. You got to keep it to our podcast channel through your favorite audio streamer, the Cincy Jungle podcast channel, as well as our YouTube channel. Go click that show icon in the bottom corner there, subscribe, click the bell to be notified, and we appreciate all of the support you've shown this show for quite some time. We'll be back with more throughout the weekend and the coming weeks ahead. John, appreciate you, man. Let's you and I both, let's start getting past this flu, cold, whatever stuff, my man.
NyQuil, ibuprofen, it's all going down tonight, baby. Let's do it.
Take care.